Welcome back, my fellow darkness dwellers, to another chilling episode of our journey into the abyss of fear. Tonight, we tune our senses to the eerie world of ghostly messages on radio frequencies. Imagine, if you will, the static hiss of an empty radio station late at night. Is it just random noise, a trick of the electronics? Or could it be something more? Something reaching out from the void, desperate to be heard. Prepare yourself for 3 spine-tingling tales that will make you question every static noise you hear. Lock your doors, turn down the lights, and hold your breath, because the stories we're about to tell are not for the faint of heart. Our story begins in the dead of night, in the cramped, dimly lit studio of a small-town radio station. The host, a seasoned veteran named Michael, was known for his smooth baritone voice and captivating stories. But one fateful evening, something truly unsettling occurred. It started subtly, a faint whisper beneath the surface of the static during a commercial break. At first, Michael dismissed it as technical interference. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the very microphone he was speaking into, a chorus of disembodied voices whispering his name. "Michael, Michael," they hissed, their voices like icy fingers trailing down his spine. Panic began to claw at Michael's composure. He tried to ignore the voices, but they were relentless, their whispers growing ever louder. Desperate, Michael tried switching microphones, but the voices persisted. The voices now morphing into guttural growls, their tone shifting from urgent to menacing. "You can't hide from us, Michael," they hissed. Driven to the brink of madness, Michael could feel his composure crumbling. He fumbled for the button to cut to a commercial, but the voices reached a fever pitch, their whispers coalescing into a single bone-chilling scream. Shaking and breathless, Michael sat slumped in his chair, knowing he was no longer alone in the studio. Our next tale takes us to the lonely highways that snake through the desolate heart of America. Our protagonist, a grizzled trucker named Frank, was no stranger to long nights and the solitude of the open road. Frank had been driving trucks for the better part of his life, his CB radio his only companion on those endless stretches of asphalt. One stormy night, as Frank was hauling a load of steel across a particularly desolate stretch of highway, he encountered something that chilled him to the bone. The wind howled outside his cab, rain lashed against the windshield, and lightning split the sky with jagged bolts of white fire. Frank reached for his CB radio, hoping to catch a friendly voice amidst the static. As he keyed the mic, a voice cut through the static, a voice that was faint and distorted, yet undeniably human. "Help me," the voice pleaded, its tone laced with a desperate urgency. "Please, someone help me." Frank's brow furrowed. The voice sounded close, very close, as if the person was speaking right into his CB. He adjusted the squelch, trying to filter out the interference from the storm, but the voice remained, faint yet persistent. "Hello?" Frank responded, his voice echoing in the confines of his cab. "Can you hear me? Who's out there?" The voice on the other end hesitated, then responded, its tone weak and filled with static. I'm trapped," the voice stammered. "There's been an accident. Please, I need help." Frank's pulse quickened. He was a seasoned trucker, and he knew that every second counted in an emergency. He tried to get a read on the voice's location, but the static was too heavy. "Where are you?" Frank pressed, his voice firm but laced with concern. "Can you tell me where you are? I'll call for help." The voice on the other end grew fainter, more distorted, as if fading into the distance. I'm on the old highway," the voice whispered, its tone barely audible above the static. "The old highway, mile marker 13. Please, hurry." Frank's blood ran cold. He knew the old highway the voice was referring to. It was a treacherous stretch of road that had been closed for years, deemed too dangerous for travel after a series of fatal accidents. A shiver ran down Frank's spine. He knew, with a growing sense of dread, that the voice on the other end of his CB radio was not of this world. Gripped by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, Frank decided to investigate. He pulled off the main highway onto a deserted service road, his headlights cutting through the driving rain. As he approached mile marker 13, Frank noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A faint light flickered in the distance, its glow barely visible through the downpour. Heart pounding in his chest, Frank cautiously approached the light, his hand hovering over the CB radio. As he got closer, he realized the light was coming from a vintage car, its headlights barely illuminating the muddy shoulder of the road. The car was battered and rusted, its windows fogged with condensation. It looked as if it had been sitting there for years, forgotten and left to decay. Frank reached for the CB, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the only response was the hiss of static. Frank cautiously approached the car, his hand hovering over the door handle. As he peered through the rain-streaked window, his blood ran cold. Slumped over the steering wheel was the skeletal figure of a man, his clothes tattered and decayed, his face locked in a silent scream. Frank stumbled back from the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew with a chilling certainty that he had just come face to face with the aftermath of a tragedy that had occurred long ago. As Frank hurried back to his truck, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against his truck like angry fists. As he pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that the desperate voice on his CB radio was still out there, forever trapped in its own personal purgatory. Chapter 3: The Haunted Family Radio. Our final tale revolves around an antique radio, a seemingly innocuous object that became a conduit for terror in the hands of an unsuspecting family. The Anderson family had inherited the old radio from a distant relative, its wooden casing polished to a sheen, its brass accents gleaming with age. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, a relic of a bygone era that they decided to display in their living room. Little did they know that this antique radio held a dark secret, a connection to a realm beyond the veil of death. At first, the radio brought the family nothing but joy. They would gather around it in the evenings, listening to old-time radio dramas and swing music, their laughter filling the room. But as the weeks turned into months, something changed. The radio began to behave erratically, switching stations on its own, its speakers emitting bursts of static at odd hours. At first, the Andersons dismissed these occurrences as mere technical glitches. However, the strange occurrences intensified. One evening, as the family was gathered for dinner, the radio, which had been silent, suddenly crackled to life. A voice, faint and distorted, whispered through the speakers, its tone laced with urgency. "Help me," the voice pleaded, its words barely audible above the static. "Please, someone help me." The Andersons exchanged uneasy glances. The voice seemed to be coming from the radio, but they couldn't be sure. They checked the dials, but the radio wasn't tuned to any station. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. The voice on the radio became a recurring nightmare, its pleas growing more desperate, its tone shifting from pleading to demanding. "Don't ignore me," the voice hissed, its tone laced with an unnerving anger. "Listen to me, you can help me." The Andersons were at their wits' end. They tried everything they could think of to make the voice stop, unplugging the radio, covering it with blankets, even taking it to an electronics repair shop. But nothing worked. The voice persisted, its presence a constant source of dread in their home. One evening, as the family was gathered in the living room, the radio suddenly emitted a deafening blast of static. The Andersons, startled, watched in horror as the radio's wooden casing began to tremble violently. Then, right before their eyes, a ghostly figure began to materialize from the radio's speakers. It was the translucent form of a young woman, her face contorted in an expression of anguish and terror. The Andersons, paralyzed with fear, could only watch in horrified silence as the ghostly figure reached out towards them, its voice echoing through the room, filled with a desperate plea. "Help me. Please, don't let me be trapped here." The ghostly figure then dissolved back into the radio, leaving the Andersons in stunned silence. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. From that day forward, the Andersons never touched the antique radio again. They moved it to the attic, hoping to distance themselves from the terrifying events they had experienced. But the memory of the ghostly figure and its desperate pleas continued to haunt them, a chilling reminder that some secrets are best left buried. And so our journey into the unsettling world of ghostly radio transmissions comes to a close, and for now. We've faced the terror of the unknown, felt the chill of whispers from beyond, and questioned the very nature of reality itself. But remember, these are just stories. Or are they? The next time you hear static on the radio, a flicker on your television screen, or a disembodied voice carried on the wind, ask yourself, are you truly alone? Thank you for joining me in the shadows tonight. Until next time, sleep tight and listen closely.